Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this third meetup of Ushahidi version 3. My name is Angela Odur. I head all things community at Ushahidi, and I'll let the rest of my fellow panelists, so to speak, introduce themselves. Brendan, want to go first?
Got it. Okay.
No, looks like you. Oh, okay. Brendan has jet planes passing over.
Well, it's okay now, actually. They just passed. But I'm Brendan O'Hanlon. I've been using Ushahidi in various ways since 2011 in Libya, well, for Libya. And I've been at various times very active with Standby Task Force, currently with Open Crisis, and involved in various Ushahidi using deployments in places like, or for places like Sudan, South Sudan, Syria, India, and so on and so on. So, yeah, I've been around a while at varying levels of activity.
Thank you so much, Brendan. Shadrock?
Yeah, hi. It's actually nice to see you, Brendan. I've definitely come across your name in some of the chats when I was doing some of the work with Standby Task Force and for USAID, so I know you by reputation, and it's great to see you on the call. I have recently left U.S. Agency for International Development and come to Ushahidi, where I'm now leading up some of our work that's funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, and the focus is called the Resilience Network Initiative. I hope that's not me. The Resilience Network Initiative, or RNI by its acronym, and essentially what we're doing is using Ushahidi tools to work with local communities and cities to build a better pipeline of communication between citizens and city government for decision-making and policy around disaster risk reduction and resilience. So that's what I've been working on, and I'm joining this call as someone who's been sort of a user and also someone who is doing a lot of work on documentation right now. We're sort of building some toolkits out that approach deployers with trying to give them a big overview about different things to think about as they make an Ushahidi deployment. So that's the roles I'm filling right now for Ushahidi.
Thank you, Shadrock. Rob just joined the call, so I'll have him introduce himself as well.
Okay. I made it just in time for intros. Good to hear. Hi everyone, I'm Rob Baker. I'm Director of Operations for Ushahidi. I've been with Ushahidi for about 4 years now, and I've worn a variety of hats in that time, starting off on the external projects team. So my background is a developer, working firsthand as technical lead or project lead for several deployments all over the world, in country and remotely. And since then, I've transitioned into more of the business side of kind of helping to keep the ship afloat. Make sure things are going on time, and just a little piece of everything, which is a lot of fun, a lot of work, a lot of fun, including some of the things it sounds like I caught the end of Shadrock's talk about the docs and the toolkits, and that I think is some of the work that's more apropos to this conversation, and some of the things that we're doing. It's an opportunity for me. One of the reasons it got me in the role was exactly that kind of work, and trying to see where, in my experience of being on the ground, being part of these cluster meetings, and working with CSOs, and in other outside of Ushahidi, the work I've done with the World Bank, with the U.S. government, trying to incorporate all this from everything we've learned here, everything that all of us have so much experience that we bring into the company from these different avenues, and to share what we've learned out of this and incorporate it into the platforms themselves and the workflows of that, and incorporate it into how you combine strategy along with the technology, and making sure that as we get more requests to launch crowdsourcing methodologies using our software, some of the data services that we're launching, that we're not step one, that we're more step 50 along the way, that really trying to put strategy first. And so that's kind of the discussion I'm looking forward to now. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Rob. Good segue to Sara, who just joined us. Hi, Sara.
Hi there. Sorry, I was busy talking to some human rights deployers, so I'm just slightly late. but
No problem.
I just missed exactly what started. Can I just quickly catch up?
Yeah, we're just doing the intro, Sarah.
Yeah, we're just doing introductions, Sarah. So you just.
Oh, sorry. So I just need to
That's
say
okay.
who I am.
Yes,
Okay.
you do.
Director of Data Projects at Ushahidi. So
Great
I'm the
stuff.
nerding one. Yes.
Thank you so much, everyone. So, Leah, if you can just click on the play button and you'll be able to listen to the conversation live, okay? So in the past few weeks, since we've done the 5 beta releases, I know that we've been focusing our discussions heavily on the technical aspects of the software, focusing a little bit more on the infrastructural changes and all of that. But with V3 in the horizon, what I've been trying to do is get us to move away from the technical aspects a little bit and put ourselves in the shoes of people who are actually using the platform. Because at the end of the day, those kind of people are the ones who help us drive the kind of features we should be building in. And today, what I'd like us to have is a very open discussion on, how Ushahidi fits into human rights mapping, whether it's someone who's been using Ushahidi version 2 or looking to use Ushahidi version 3 in the future. What are some of the goals that human rights mappers tend to have? How does the tool tend to meet it? What are some of the different pain points that they face? And what are the opportunities that are presented to them as we move along in terms of providing the necessary tools to solve these problems? So, I don't know. I think I'll start off by just naming a few examples of the human rights maps that I know of. The major one, obviously, is harassment by the folks in Egypt. We all know about Women Under Siege Syria, which is basically using the platform to try and document human rights violations against women in terms of sexual violence. Tell Mama UK, who are trying to document cases of harassment against Muslims and things like that. I don't know if any of the panelists have any examples that also come to mind, or if you've been involved in any specific ones. I know a couple of you were involved in the Libya deployments, but I will not speak to that. Sarah? You're on mute, Sarah.
Sorry, I was typing up notes. Pick on someone else for a second, and I'll just come back to it.
Brendan, you okay if I pick on you?
Yeah, sure. I suppose the ones that I've been using, which are relating to human rights in various different ways, sometimes more direct, sometimes more indirect, would have been maybe a crisis map for OCHA, and then more disaster-related disaster response cases, such as for Samoa and Paco Yolanda in the Philippines, and then various other little things, such as, of course, the Uchaguzi state deployment, which is where I got to know you, Angela, and also various things relating to Sudan, demonstrations, mapping demonstrations, their mapping response to the government, and used to a smaller extent, I think, perhaps in South Sudan, although I don't think that was sustained. And yeah, I think there's probably several other cases as well that don't immediately come to mind.
All right. Just to focus a little bit more on Libya, I don't know if you'd be okay taking us through, so during that time, what were the goals of the deployment at that time? Why a map to map out the crisis during that time? Yeah. What were the goals?
Well, I think the initial objective was probably just so that the UN and NGOs that were getting information from the UN could get an overview of where things were happening, where there were, for example, IDPs, where there was also violence, where there were needs in terms of medical and just generally sort of food and other humanitarian supplies, in an attempt to try and get a picture of that. I mean, I think Libya Crisis Map was probably a very imperfect deployment in a lot of ways, but then again, it was a very early stage. It came, I think it was probably the second big deployment of the online sort of crowdsourcing crisis response community after Haiti. And, looking back, I think a lot of lessons were learned. The UN changed the way they did some of the things, and certainly, for example, the Standby Task Force, which I think initiated that deployment, although I wasn't involved at that stage, again, it changed their policies in terms of, you know, what kind of crises they would respond to, and again, some of their procedures. So yeah, I mean, it looks a rather different sort of world now to the one we had in 2011. We were quite naive in a lot of ways, and I hope, you know, still we managed to do some good.
All right, Sara?
Well, speaking as the naive person who set up that map, the reason we created that map was because there was no other data. The UN was looking at going into a hot situation almost completely blind. We had some very brave souls inside the country who were trying to reach out and tell us what was happening. And we had people from outside who were sneaking over the border to go and get information. But it was very, very much a completely blacked out state at the time. So we started the maps because we knew there was going to be some form of humanitarian crisis. We didn't know exactly what form, and I can remember when the GIS team asked me where they should start concentrating, where they mapped. I said, check all of the checkpoints. Map all of the border checkpoints because people are going to run for the border. And that's what happened. Most of the things that we mapped initially were people being stuck at the border, being stuck without supplies. We mapped the types of supplies that organizations were bringing in. So we mapped who was coming in with what to help. As time progressed and we got more connection to the people in country, we were mapping the events. And I know that some of those ended up in some fairly high courts. So I'm still we don't, I guess, I don't talk about some of the things we saw because I'm still not sure whether they're legally embargoed or not. But yes, Brendan, it was naive in a way. But by then we'd already had, I think, 6-8 deployments since Haiti. We did a lot of work in Crisis Commons. We did a lot of work starting a standby task force. And this one was special because of the implicit dangers. One thing that nobody ever talks about is one of the trusted reporters was killed during that deployment. Not as a result of the deployment, but the idea of safety of everybody. Not just, you're not just mapping people on the ground who are at risk, but the people who are reporting are at risk, the people who are mapping are at risk, and you have to be very, very, very aware of safety and security of everybody in that situation. And one of the things that happened after that was that the Standby Task Force decided not to work in conflict situations because of the difficulty of guaranteeing those safeties. So that if you're doing human rights mapping of any kind, you've always got to remember the people. You've always got to start with do no harm. I'm not sure if that was the answer. That's, I think, where we've got to start, always.
No. That was actually a very good entry point because there are a couple of issues that you just brought up, with the major one in my mind right now being security. So I think this is a question I'm throwing off to Rob and Shadrock as well once Sara does answer this. But in that situation, do you think that there are ways that platforms could help you do no harm?
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in. I think one of the things to consider here, and this may seem a little sort of policy-oriented or a little wonky, but I think it's important, is that there is a distinction between a humanitarian response and a human rights response. So groups like Amnesty International, groups like Human Rights Watch operate at a very different political level than a United Nations entity does when it goes actually to give support. And as I was taking notes and listening to Sara, I think one of the things that came up for me that is really important is the idea of something being evidentiary versus being for coordination. I think a lot of the humanitarian, broadly written humanitarian deployments we see are really about there's little bits of data somewhere, and we need to try and get it and coordinate with other people, or maybe we need to create it, and it's sort of very logistically heavy. Where, on the other hand, a lot of they're not Ushahidi deployments, but other activities that I have been involved in with Amnesty International or with groups like Witness, is not necessarily about formulating a response. It's about documenting something that can later be used in some sort of legal proceedings. So when you look at it that way, a couple things come to mind. I think one is that the issue of security is really paramount, and that you do have to have a really good understanding of the security of your platform, the idea of how you're going to secure the well-being of your trusted reporters and sources. And I think there, as far as a technical angle for Ushahidi, we really need to look at mobile devices. What's happening there, is that something that we want to incorporate? What would that look like to do? And I think the focus there is much more becoming about documenting things and having them sealed off and protected, and have everyone protected, as opposed to a coordination effort where you might have a lot more people who are a little more relaxed about, look, this is a spreadsheet of where I'm delivering water, fine, throw it in the deployment, something like that. So I think there's an important distinction there to be made. And once you make that, suddenly security and the ability to accurately document vaults to the top. That's just from my opinion, but that's kind of how I'm seeing it.
No, I agree. One of the things that I know I appreciated most about the Libya deployment is beyond I think what Sara and Shadrock have said, a do no harm strategy, an attention towards security and privacy to the extent that we're able to provide from both a strategic standpoint as well as a technical one, and having multiple deployments, multiple servers, firewalling that data, making sure that it wasn't all going into the the one deployment, that everything that went public as part of the public version of that had been very well vetted. A lot of great lessons that I think came out of all those deployments from Haiti and even a few beyond or before. Putting together those lessons learned, but what I appreciated the most is the managing of expectations around that, and that I think was one of the biggest faults coming out of even during Haiti, even during a lot of those deployments where the intention was to be a functional and operational part of the coordination efforts, but was really just observational at best because we were still learning as we were going. In this case, what we were doing, and where I've seen a lot of the most success, both from really something operational as well as successes in security and in privacy and in these do no harm strategies, is when organizations, be them larger coalitions or just even down to the CSO level, use these as more dashboards to do sense making, to bear witness, to get a better sense of what's happening on the ground, and to make decisions for themselves out of that, and not try to go the full loop as many tend to do and tend to aim for with this, which is, we're going to gather this information, we're going to do the sense making, and then we're going to incorporate that into the existing tool sets and procedures that people have been using for decades, and thinking that it's all really going to come together and make it a part of the coordination, as well as trying to publicize this for the media and most ideally for the folks on the ground. And that's when things tend to slip. So when we have deployments like Libya, and as there have been many since, that I feel are really doing it right, where they're taking a more measured response and saying, this is something for our team that we're going to use to not replace, not do a rip and replace of current procedures, not think that the technology, just by being more up to date, both in the methodology or something that looks new and shiny, is a better and faster way to do things, but we're going to use this to complement the procedures and the practices that everyone is in tune with, that people have been using, and it's not an ingredient, it's more of a spice. And when we do it that way, and we manage the expectations of the teams in this way, and use it, I think, on the ground as well, and not try to go out and advertise this service to folks that are really in the thick of it, to the individuals and families that are feeling it the worst, and to say that we're going to provide you with up-to-date information about everything from where water is as to security checkpoints. That's when it really comes together, and that I think was the decision made around the Libya deployment that made it among the most successful to date, even because they really kind of set those boundaries for themselves, and out of that set better security and privacy practices, set better practices for what gets released to the public, and just by managing those expectations on both sides, just made it, I think, a model we continue to learn from today.
Yeah, I think sorry, go ahead, Sara.
I was going to say, we've been talking about Libya and conflict maps, but the risks are across a lot of these witness-bearing programs. Another map that I'm involved with on the side is one that's mapping sexuality and gender-based violence. And if you're doing that in an area like Uganda, where up until recently there was a death penalty for being gay, you're talking about having to protect your sources from the state, not just from the reprisals that might come if you even show where they are. So that security goes across, I think, every level of this type of map. I'm not sure if that was useful, but I just wanted to just say it's not just about conflict.
Yeah, I think it's definitely not just something that is centered around conflict alone, which is why we're actually having this kind of discussion. So thank you both for those comments. It's something that Rob said that I think Shadrock also agrees on. That you're looking at the tech as more of adding a little spice to existing procedures and existing kind of initiatives already. So I guess my question here would be, beyond just looking at security itself, I know I was speaking to one of the deployers who's working with sexual harassment against women, and one of the challenges that came up was the structure of the data. I don't know if that's something that you guys also faced as a challenge when you were collecting data in Libya or in other deployments. Do you feel like that's a problem or an issue?
I know I do. And I think one of the reasons I appreciate organizations that use this as more of a dashboard for their own internal purposes first, before putting out statements, data, whatever format they need to the public, is that you end up putting out a format that the public can more easily comprehend and digest, and one that I think connects them more personally with this as well. What I mean by this is, our software itself has, I think, putting out a public website, people think that the input channel needs to be the same, the output needs to be the same as the input. So we take in the information, we process it, categorization, translation, geolocation, put it back out there. When that's made public, I don't know that takes enough of the noise out of the signal for the public. Whereas if we tend to use these for more internal groups first, or at least better trained internal groups that are managing the software, as well as maybe a few key partners, CSOs, individuals who know the community on the ground and have those trust networks in place, then what you end up is something that can feed into doing a better situation report that can then be brought back out to the public in what I think are more effective means, and that's everything. Well, and then you get into the country context of what it is you're working on, be it conflict or some other social need. As well as getting into, maybe it should go out via radio. Maybe we should have some of these trusted CSOs go out and deliver this information. Maybe it needs to just go on posters. Maybe there needs to be storytelling. I mean, there's a whole variety of things that I don't feel that we would turn to if the technology didn't get in the way. And this is one of these cases where, the technology becomes kind of the anti-solution here of getting in the way of these old means of which people have been communicating with each other for some time, and we kind of abscond with those trust networks and put something in place that needs to be retaught and relearned and retrusted, and it's not as effective. And I think that putting the data and making sense of it, and then making sense of it in such a degree that we're putting it in a format that makes the most sense to the people on the ground, and in a delivery mechanism that makes the most sense given the context, is absolutely one of the most critical parts of this.
So Sarah's actually posed a very good question here on the side. We've talked about building in data visualization into Ushahidi version 3. But what else do we need to do to better support storytelling with all these different platforms? I don't know if that's a question that Shadrock wants to answer.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts from my own point of view. I do think that building out data viz, I do think that spending some time to sharpen our tools around how reports are georeferenced. I think a lot of those technical approaches are important and they can help. But at the end of the day, I don't know that it's Ushahidi's job to really think, how do we improve storytelling? That's the deployer's job. And I think that I think there's a fine line there where you kind of have to, kind of getting to Rob's point, you have to be careful sort of about what we are going to try and think our tools can do. As a short response to that, you know, and so Sarah's just made a comment to support storytelling. How do we support storytelling? Which I think is a good way to look at that. I think on our end, I think we really, really, really need to look at what's happening in mobile development. Because when you talk about these places where the access to the V3 in itself poses a huge problem, you know, radio is better used, posters are better used, focus groups are better used. If you have, you know, someone like Brendan, or you have these other sort of very highly trained individuals running a deployment, their need then becomes to get away from the V3 and go and get involved with that focus group, or go out on the street and take the picture of the poster or whatever. And so I think that looking at how you allow people to not necessarily have to interact more with the V3 instance via web, but allow it just to set it up and then feed into it from more remote locations. To me, that's a technological thing that we could look at that would be very, very important. So that's my sort of gut reaction.
Sara, what else are we doing beyond just the web platform in terms of visualization? Are we actually thinking about looking at mobile, the same way that Shadrock was mentioning? Is that something that we're thinking about building into V3?
I think you would have to ask Woody that question.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just concentrating on getting the data science elements together.
Mm-hmm.
That piece solid for the platform. Okay. Oh, I was going to ask Brendan, but he's run away.
No problem. All right.
I think the idea of a mobile strategy, I mean, I don't say that because I think it's something that should necessarily be rolled out right now. I think that's a longer-term investment. You know, and that, I mean, Sara and the crew are certainly working really hard right now to get out these, you know, these versions, and I wouldn't want to like just top load that with, hey, now we need mobile stuff. I think that's more of a long-term, like 6 months, 12 months. You know, how do we start investing the capacity to do that? So.
All right, Brendan's back with an answer for you, Sara.
What exactly were you saying? That was something about data and structuring, or what do groups need? Well, we've had a conversation a little bit like this just recently when we were looking at how we might respond to the developing situation with floods in Sudan. And one of the things that I was stressing, and I think our progress has been, although I haven't looked at it in great detail, is data flexibility. That in terms of being able to take data that are coming out of a deployment and then visualizing it and then bringing it back in and you know, importing, exporting, and doing that related with problems, that you're not losing the integrity of the data, etc. Did you get all that, or did my computer freeze?
We got it.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So I know that there are a couple of major issues that came up in today's discussion. I know we talked about security, we've talked about data formats, and I think there's also some level of flexibility, even though we didn't really cover that. I want to throw a question. She's features representative from V3. In the work that you're doing beyond just the data science stuff, what features are we seeing actually getting built in that will help kind of solve these problems?
Well, to me, it's all data science, but I would say that, wouldn't I? So a lot of this is about making good use of the API, because all the data in the platform is coming through the API up to the front end. That's also accessible from outside. So we can then import, export that. I'm working on the CSV upload, which I know, Brendan, we talked about having to make that more flexible and making it more possible to load in. I'm looking at Shadrock, specifically things like the location lists. So making the different parts of the platform more accessible in terms of data to specialists like the GIS crowd, who have been a little bit forgotten up to now. So yes.
All right. So I can see that we have a question from Leah Park, who's working on the Palestine crisis map. I don't know if most of you can see it, but I think I'll just pick out one specific sentence that struck me. She's saying that from the Palestine crisis map point of view, preserving the category's ability to frame human rights issues is very important. What are we doing in terms of that on V3? Is the question clear?
No, could you
No.
repeat?
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me just read out the entire comment. So she says she's looked at the Libya map and read the report back, and she's very aware of security and managing expectations. For the Palestine crisis map, to witness and see human rights trends over time, they for the next iteration, because the Palestine map works in warm to hot, long-term hot environment. Compiling accurate geocoordinating DB of Palestinian villages is very important to them. Right now, they're having a battle, on choosing whether to use Google or SM level, for example. So for them, preserving categories is extremely important for them as they move from version 2 to version 3. I don't know if that has made things a little clearer.
Oh, right. So this is the migration from version 2 to a version 3 map.
Exactly.
One of the things we've been doing as features, I take the features role on V3, is making a full feature description of what's already in V2. So, Angela, you've been part of that. We've spent long nights sitting, working this through. And what we've done is we've mapped everything that's in V2 at the moment and checked it all for an equivalence in V3 and how it transfers. In terms of preserving things like categories, that's going to be a straight database transfer. So categories remain in V3. That's okay. You don't need to worry about that. There was another part of the question I had an answer to, and I've forgotten the question, the start of the question. Oh, yeah, things like the village locations. I know Shadrock is going to want to leap on this, because this is one of his bugbears as well. But one of the things I started designing and building for V2 before moving on to V3 was a better way of getting at the location fields behind the map and being able to add your own geolocation list, so name of place, lat and long, into a Ushahidi instance, so you check that as well as the gazetteers behind Google or OpenStreetMap. Shadrock, your floor. This is your expertise.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot yet to be done with Ushahidi, and Sarah's touched on a couple really important points right there. And I know this is something that we've all of us on deployments in countries where the operating language is not English have struggled with. You have things that are spelled differently or diacritical marks in names, and depending on the geocoding service you're using, those may or may not match whatever data you're trying to bring in. Certain geocoding services may function in languages that are hard for certain, sort of contributors, users, reporters, whatever you'd like to call them, to contribute. So the gazetteer geocoding issue is definitely a big one. I think as far as precision, I've put in a couple fabricator flags on simple ways that you can roughly talk about the precision of a report, how zoomed in a reporter was when they made the map or when they made that report. I think that's very important for GIS folks. I think one of the things to loop back around to Leah's initial starting point, and I'm not sure if I understand, but I'll take a stab at it, is that their map is following trends over a long period of time. This is the tension and the conflict there has been going on for a long time, and it stops and starts. There are times when it's militaristic. There are times when it's going to be human rights related. There are times when, at least for Palestinians inside Israel, it's a question of governance. There's a lot of different things that are happening after you drop that pin in the map. So I think it's one of the things I've always struggled with was I can report that something is happening here right now, but that changes over time, and how can I keep amending that report and keep updating about what's happening in that place? So that was something that I know that CrowdMap was looking at, was the ability to comment on a post or a report. And I don't know what that looks like in V3, but I'm wondering if that functionality exists. If you can sort of continue to have a thread over time associated with one point, and that might be something to answer Leah's comments. I'm not sure, but I'm sort of posing it. I see Sarah's made a comment that they do have comments on reports, so that's apparently in V3, and I would ask if that is something that would maybe help Leah out there.
Yeah.
You and being checked on the cross-check there.
Yeah. She actually just added in another comment. So she says, Google and OpenStreetMap themselves are actually having a battle between the two sides. So sheer accurate mapping in conditions of population transfer is actually very crucial. So for her, she's saying that adding in multiple points in sequence for one report is important too. Right now in version 2, only the first location point is automated. The rest are all by hand. Sara, do we have something like that in V3? I know that we have polygons better improved on V3 right now. I don't know if we have the multiple points in sequence being properly done in V3 right now.
Multiple points in sequence. I think we'll have to park that one and check in with Robbie, who's been doing a lot of the GIS coding on V3. But we'll definitely put that into the stack.
All right.
There was one, I can't remember, I get a bit confused between Open Explorer, CrowdMap, and V3 because I jump in and out of all the different repos and Fabricator. But I think someone at some point had flagged the idea that, even for doing reports by hand, that perhaps you could offer a functionality where you were prompted, the location would be prompted from the last report you made as a way to sort of quickly go through, if I have 10 reports to make at this spot, each time I make a new report, it automatically puts the pin there where I last was versus making me start new. And I don't know if that was in V3 or if that was in one of the other tools, but that was something that I've seen and maybe part of a solution for this issue.
I think that was probably one of the other tools. I don't recall us having that kind of conversation for V3, but that definitely does sound like something we should be thinking about. So maybe we add that to Fabricate or have us discuss that and figure out if we can actually build that in. Right, Sara? Oh, she's on mute. Sara, you're on mute. Uh-oh, I think we lost Sara.
I see her still.
Yeah.
Write her a note. Yeah, I think one of the
tabs going that I lost.
There we go.
I lost the Hangout. Yes, I was looking through Fabricator as we were talking to see if that feature was in. I might just chuck it in as a feature, and then we can, if it's a duplicate, at least we've got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Okay.
If I understand correctly, Leah's kind of struggling with two different things. One is what Sarah's already sort of getting at in this thing that's been identified about adding your own locations, adding your own lists, being able to update with places that may not appear in an existing gazetteer or geocoding service. And then the other one is this one that we're kind of talking about now, which is the actual manual act of entering things in, and how can we make that maybe a little bit faster for someone who has to do a whole bunch of work by hand. So if those are maybe two distinct things in Fabricator, that might help. That's just the way I'm understanding that's the way I'm interpreting Leah's comment.
All right. So I know that this is a very interesting discussion that we're having, but we are 9 minutes over time. I know I do need to release Shadrock to go back to documentation, and then but I guess what I'd like to say is thank you for joining me today and for invigorating this kind of discussion. For anybody else who's watching who has any more questions, let's keep the conversation going, whether it's on this thread right now, or if you can get aboard and add in some of your comments. It would be really good to keep this conversation going. We really want to try and make sure that whatever it is we're building in V3 actually does meet your needs. So we need you to tell us what you need. And we will continue to listen to all of you guys. So I know I say this a lot. Without further ado, I will end this broadcast and see you all next time. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Thanks, Angie. Thanks, everyone.